I am Rob, and welcome to my dungeon laboratory. Here's where I tinker with all of the different rules of different games that interest me, and try to improve upon formulas that perhaps have a little bit of room to be adjusted, tweaked, and so on to better fit my style of play. Recently, I've been playing Massive Darkness with some friends of mine. And Massive Darkness, if you haven't seen it, I've had several videos, including gameplay footage from my cardboard series. It is a board game, ostensibly, where you take control of characters with highly detailed models, and you move them around strategically in a dungeon setting where monsters can pop up and you can fight them. And you're looking to fight the monsters to gain experience and power, and find treasures which allow you to do new and cool things. Does that sound familiar? Sounds like the premise in a lot of fantasy role-playing games, and there's a good reason for that. There's a lot of elements in Massive Darkness that work well when dovetailed along with some other core concepts in fantasy role-playing games. At their heart, a role-playing game is a series of rules that allow you to do something, and imagine a character in a fantasy world that does the things that you say, or at least has a chance to. These rules include things like resolution for conflict, combat, other types of challenges, athletics, stealth, different things that you can do. Well, Massive Darkness has some of those elements already wrapped up inside of itself. It's concentrating on combat, but I think we can do a little bit more with it. So, this is my dungeon lab, and we are going to be working on coming up with elements from Dungeons & Dragons and blending them with elements from Massive Darkness to create a rules-light role-playing game out of Massive Darkness, the board game. So, fasten your seatbelts, get ready, because we're going to be talking a lot about game theory and how to adapt different elements. Might be a little dry in places, but I think you might find it to be very interesting if you are also interested in mad science tweaking and adapting. So, allow me to welcome you to Dungeons and Darkness. Since we're not going into any of the heavy lifting for this, the hard hat isn't quite necessary. Right now we're going to be concentrating primarily on the elements of the core of both of the games, and figuring out what works with one and what works with the other, and seeing what we can do. Massive Darkness is a refined game. It comes after generations of board games that have tried to have rules-light role-playing games incorporated into themselves. Some of them were just fanciful adaptations of role-playing games. For example, one of my favorites is Dragon Strike, which is a game that is basically Dungeons & Dragons light. About as much elements of the Dungeons & Dragons game as Massive Darkness has in terms of role-playing. Everything is about combat resolution and resolving core, conflict. There are more elements in Dragon Strike, as it is kind of a primer for the proper role-playing game, including things like disarming traps and other elements that are a little bit more closely tied into the role-playing game. But in a similar fashion, everything is kind of scaled down and made very simple so that anybody can pick it up and play without having to learn a bunch of complex rules, which is kind of the barrier for entry for a lot of role-playing games. Dungeons & Dragons is not a stranger to that. A lot of people, when invited to come into playing a game of Dungeons & Dragons, if they have no experience with role-playing games before, the first reaction might be, am I going to have to learn a lot of rules? There are some rules and concepts that you have to learn for Dungeons & Dragons. They're not terribly complicated in the latest iteration of the game, but even so, that is more than some people are willing to go through. Massive Darkness also has rules and elements. However, it makes the barrier of entry slight because It uses brightly colored dice and simple concepts rather than dealing with math and adaptation. Everything is very, very streamlined to the point in terms of a proper role-playing game of oversimplification, missing certain concepts and things that would make it a little bit more suitable for being considered as a role-playing game. This doesn't make it a bad game, it just changes the situation in which you would play it. In other words, it's a board game with some of the trappings of role-playing games. Now, when people think about role-playing games, a lot of times they assume that there are going to be certain elements involved with role-playing games. For example, the ability to improve yourself throughout the play of the game. That your character starts at a certain point, not the most powerful, not the most awesome character, but eventually grows and develops if you are successful, and eventually attains more power, more abilities, more cool things that you can do. Massive Darkness has this. Every character has a class, much as Dungeons & Dragons, and each of those classes has a character sheet, much like Dungeons & Dragons. On that sheet are patterned different paths and abilities that you can attain. Well, Dungeons & Dragons has that too. All of the abilities and advantages, skills, powers in Massive Darkness pertain to the elements in the board game, however. There isn't any extra bits lying around for extrapolating into other scenarios other than crawling through a dungeon and fighting off lots of monsters. This is intentional and fine. This is the workaround that we're going to be doing here in the lab. So, if we are going to be doing this, let's first of all acknowledge what the difference is in the two and how the different systems work. We'll start with Dungeons & Dragons. Dungeons & Dragons has a character sheet, but it's got a lot of blank space on it until you fill it out and you have your character all ready to go. Most of the blank spaces are there because you have a lot of choices. There are 12 different core classes that you can go into for the if you have access to the book. If not, then you can use the basic rules for free, available from wizards.com, and that outlines the core, most basic characters of the game. So anybody can pick it up and make one of these characters. Creating the character is short and to the point. You either roll dice, or you use a point-buy system, or you can just take some pre-generated numbers and put them into your character's basic attributes. From there, you choose the class that you're going to play, which will have an impact on every aspect of how you play for the career of that character. For example, if you're playing a fighter, you're going to probably have a very different style than if you had played a rogue, than if you had played a wizard, than if you had played a paladin or a warlock or a bard. So, choosing that is certainly one of the most important choices that you can make. You also get to choose a race, which, depending on the game, may or may not have huge implications, but it will give you some stat increases and possibly a few extra skills or abilities that you have inherent to the race that you've chosen. From that point, you find out how many hit points you have, and many times playing you start with maximum for your level, but as you level up, you roll dice to determine how many more hit points that you have. You have a proficiency system, which means that as you go up levels, your skills get better. You are capable of getting higher and higher dice rolls. And you have a variety of skills, many of which are determined by your class and choices that you've made. You also have a background, which provides you with extra choices for skills and also gives you your starting gear. That is not provided by your class. The class gives you the gear that makes sense for your class. The background gives you things that make sense for the way that you live your life before you kick into that adventuring career. The character sheet gives you lots of room so that you can have access to all the information on one page. Your attributes, your skills, the weapons that you'll use and what dice you need to roll for them. The different abilities and more room so that as you go up levels and get new abilities, you have room for those on your sheet as well. All of it is presented on one page, and on the back is extra resources that you can use for filling in notes and what have you. If you use the double-sided, it's got extra things so that you can keep track of your exploits, your deeds, people that you've contacted and know, and so on and so forth. The sheet is very efficient. Everything is sorted out in places so that your eye can easily be drawn to the things as you need them. If you need to reference your armor class, for example, it's right there front and center on your sheet. If you need to reference your the things that you use the most, like for example your combat abilities, that's dead center in the middle of the front of the page. The information about who your character is, just like most filing systems, is in the upper left-hand corner, and directly below that are your vital statistics. Fairly straightforward and very easy to use. So, Massive Darkness also has these character sheets, and on them are some similar statistics. The name of your character, being the heroic icon that you have chosen, which matches the miniature that you have. However much experience that you have, so that if you're playing a campaign, you can carry your experience from one session to the next. A list of abilities that you have to remind you of what your character can do. And this also has all of the different abilities that you can achieve. Because this isn't a proper role-playing game, these aren't on some separate manual. It's all here on the character sheet so that you can buy the things, tick them off on the sheet as you unlock new skills, powers, and levels, and have that record in front of you at all times. It is very efficient. It is very streamlined and very easy to use, and immediately look at your sheet and know what you can and cannot do. So, lots of similarities. Now, for the extra stuff that the D&D character sheet has that the Massive Darkness doesn't have, a lot of those are going to involve things that matter more in the Dungeons & Dragons game. The role-playing elements and the world elements around your characters. Massive Darkness, you're really only going to worry about what you have in front of you. The monsters that you have yet to face, the treasures that you have, which are going to stack up on your in your space quite quickly. You can carry a lot of treasures in this game, as well as the abilities that you have. But since there isn't role-playing elements in the game where your character can talk to another person, unless there are some sort of objectives to be achieved, it's relatively straightforward. You see a monster, you shoot, stab, or zap a monster. Dungeons & Dragons gives you a lot of other elements to care about. Not only do you oftentimes have this overarching goal in front of you that your character should care about, saving the world, stopping a menace, something of that nature. In addition, your character is also going to have things that matter to them. The role that you are playing is going to have elements that you're going to care about beyond just killing the bad guys and taking their treasure, oftentimes. Again, you can streamline Dungeons & Dragons down to be nothing more than a dungeon crawl 2, in which case a lot of those elements aren't going to matter very much. Your bonds, your flaws, things like that. If you take away the role-playing aspect, as in the playing of a character, then those things could be left blank, and your character sheet starts looking a lot more like the Massive Darkness sheet. Some people prefer to play that way, and that's fine. That's all on how you would choose to enjoy the game. But the important elements that will come about again and again and again are presented front and center, and anything else is the addition of the world and other interests to your characters, beyond just the narrow focus fighting the darkness. So that's going to be primarily the differences. It's going to be expanding on those elements that this sheet doesn't have to kind of fall more in line with a proper role-playing game. The combat is already fine. If we're not going to change the mechanics, and right now we're not interested in changing the mechanics, we still have the 4 different colored dice that Massive Darkness uses, and that ability to resolve that kind of a conflict. If we're going to port elements from Dungeons & Dragons into Massive Darkness, we're going to need to concentrate on not adding extra elements, like extra dice. We want to do everything using the dice that we have, so that even though we're interested in introducing new concepts, we don't have to add a bunch of extra kit. Let's keep the strengths of Massive Darkness where they are. Likewise, when it comes to take elements from Massive Darkness and move them to Dungeons & Dragons, that's going to require a bit more extrapolation, because there's a lot of extra things that Dungeons & Dragons involves. For instance, these dice are fine for simulating a lot of things. You have blue and green dice to simulate armor and your defense. Well, Dungeons & Dragons has an armor class, which is a target-based system for rolling a 20-sided die, adding your modifiers, and trying to hit. After that, then there's a completely different system for figuring out how much damage that you do. In Massive Darkness, it's all elegantly handled in one roll. Whatever excess that you have for the attacking dice that exceeds the defensive dice is how much damage that you do. All in one go, very simple, very straightforward, and that is a strength of a board game. It can take a lot of different concepts and put them all together and streamline them. Now, we're not going to take away from the strength of Massive Darkness. The combat system is already pretty rich and robust. Whatever we take from Dungeons & Dragons in terms of combat, be that monsters or whatever, we're going to have to take those elements that are unimportant to Massive Darkness. Those can be set aside, and then we'll have to figure out how to adapt the other numbers in. But for now, we're just dealing with considering the differences in concepts. So, Dungeons & Dragons uses a base D20 system for its resolution. In general, whenever you want to do a thing, you roll a 20-sided die. If you're particularly good at the thing, that means that you are trained and are proficient in it, and you would add a preset number to that die roll. In addition, if it has anything to do with one of your 6 abilities, strength, dexterity, constitution, wisdom, intelligence, or charisma, you would add or subtract the number modifier based on how high or how low that statistic is. If you have a particularly high statistic, then that attribute is going to give a modifier that it positively modifies your 20-sided die roll. A particularly low statistic will decrease the value of the die roll, meaning that you may have to overcome weaknesses sometimes to succeed at things you're just not inclined to do. So, by sticking to the things that are within the primary roles and responsibilities of your character, you give yourself the best chance of succeeding. It's when you have to try to do things your character is not good at, then you have to deal with penalties and disadvantages. So, that in a nutshell is Dungeons & Dragons in the 5th edition. It's all roll a die, add numbers, see what your number is. That's actually probably the easiest and most stripped down Dungeons & Dragons has ever been. In very first edition, it was roll a die and compare it to a matrix, where you would look and you would see if your number fell and what effect that has. If you're making a saving throw, you would roll and see if on the grid, if that number was higher than or equal to the number that you needed to hit for the saving throw. Combat was handled in much the same way, and similarly, there weren't skills or other things. A lot of those things were kind of shoehorned organically by players and game masters and dungeon masters over time. Skills became something that people, wanted to diversify what your character can do, knowing the kind of things that your character from his background and training would be able to do, rather than just special abilities like a thief's open lock skill. So, since we were already using a 20-sided die for most of the mechanics, it went to, from the matrix, it actually went to a set target number, which was generally implied by the matrix first, but then you would be more interested in copying over the number and listing the number on your sheet. And you would actually start using math in terms of what's called THAC0, which first made its appearance in AD&D, in the Dungeon Master's Guide, but became a core concept in 2nd edition, where you would roll the die, you would mentally apply the THAC0 of your character, the number that you needed to hit armor class of 0, and either go up or down from what you roll to find out what armor class that you hit, which could be anywhere from as low as an armor class of 10, which is the highest number, but the worst armor class, all the way down to negative, I fought an enemy once that had negative 13 armor class, so generally about a 20-point range, appropriate. So as your characters advanced, your THAC0 would drop, and that meant that you would be able to hit lower armor classes with more ease. Then when we got to 3rd edition, everything went to additive math, and never looked back after that. Everything became add this to this. You would have a base to hit bonus that replaced THAC0. Basically, it turned to simple math. Roll a 20-sided die, add that number. If you had an attribute bonus, you would add that. And another thing that 3rd edition was really big for was all the magical items and other stuff that you would add to numbers. Eventually to the point where you would oftentimes, at a high-level character, have lots of different modifiers to make the math go higher and higher and higher. Eventually, if you could get to an epic game, you could have armor classes that were well above 50 or more than that. Hit points could get into the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. You would have people who were doing iterative attacks that could do, say, 5 attacks in a round, figuring out the math on each one, and it would be a declining bonus for each hit after the first to strike. The math could get a little silly. If those people who really don't have a problem with math, 3rd edition was a kind of a godsend, because suddenly all the doors were unlocked and you felt like you could do pretty much anything. You like a class that has abilities that you don't have, boom, it's like going to a buffet and picking out something. You would just add those abilities to your character and don't look back. This was also the glory of the time of builds, calculating the richest abilities and most powerful skills so that you could end up Frankensteining a monster of a character together that was nearly unstoppable in your focus. So then they decided to go into 4th edition. 4th edition was a little strange because it looked at all of the abuses that 3rd edition and their higher math and all the access to classes and prestige classes and massive amounts of splat books and third-party sources and all kinds of things that really cluttered up 3rd edition. And they said, okay, we're going to concentrate on balance and playability and make sure everybody has fun. They kept the core mechanics of rolling a 20-sided die, but they dropped the math down so that it wasn't as complex and convoluted. And while there was still a ton of magical items, a lot of times you only had so much access to those magical items. To reduce a reliance on one class or another, they added implements like healing surges so that after a fight, you didn't need to rely on the cleric standing around and dishing out healing for everybody. You just do a healing surge, and boom, you got back a quarter of your hit points. If you needed another one, well, you usually had a few healing surges at the very least, and some classes had lots of healing surges, and different ways of unlocking them in the middle of a fight. So, 4th edition changed the formula, but you could see if you follow the progression, 3rd to 4th to 5th. 5th edition said, okay, all the higher math, all the crazy magical items, let's just draw it back to basics. Again, 20-sided die, roll, add your attribute modifier and possibly your proficiency modifier, and generally that's it. There's not a lot of other things that are going to modify, so everything is relatively straightforward. When you have a character that can make multiple attacks, you just roll the die a couple of times and add the same numbers. If you score a critical hit, for example, you just roll a 20. Congratulations, you do double damage. All straightforward, relatively easy to use. And rather than crazy tables of modifiers that also increase math, you have a simple advantage-disadvantage mechanic to compass when something is harder than it should be or easier than it otherwise would be by default. So, that is Dungeons & Dragons in a nutshell. Everything else is the differences in the classes and whatever else that you can do, and limited only by the imagination of the Dungeon Master and the players involved. Straightforward. That's Dungeons & Dragons. Now, Massive Darkness, on the other hand, is a game that is wrapped around a couple of core concepts. You start out as a plain adventurer. You pick a hero, which has some abilities. You pick a class, which also has some abilities. You can pick a class that complements your hero. For example, if you take Bjorn, who is a big, strong, powerful warrior, and you pair him up with Shadow Barbarian, he's going to have things that allow him to really hurt things at close range. And the skills that he has for being Bjorn dovetail nicely with the skills from that class, so that you are going to really be focused on getting up close to things, tanking for your group, and smashing things. Depending on the skill sets that you choose from your character as you advance, you can change your focus, or again, really choose to focus on one element of your class combination, and that makes you even more effective at that, which becomes very important as the monsters get bigger and more powerful. The core combat resolution involves choosing dice which are going to be based on your gear. Your gear becomes supremely important in the game. Even your defense, your armor is going to be based around whatever armor you're wearing, and possibly you might have a hand weapon that may give you some bonuses to your defense, like the starting gear of the longsword, which gives you a blue die, the least powerful, but adds to your defense. Everybody starts with a suit of leather armor, which is a value of 1 blue die. When something attacks you, you roll your defense and they roll their attack, but the person who is being attacked rolls everything together so that you can instantly look at the dice, compare. The attacks have swords, the defense have shields. If there's more swords than there are shields, you do damage, take as many points of damage as you have swords, which means that if the dice go cold for you on defense, no matter how many dice you roll, you can be open to a big attack. So every attack has a chance, although once you start going to opponents that have lots of dice, and especially the more potent green dice for defense, you start to get kind of frustrated if you don't have powerful attack dice of your own or some means of mitigating those dice. As you get better and better gear, you roll more dice and better grades. There's 2 grades to the attack dice and the defense dice. The attack dice, and this is all going to be kind of old hat if you are a Massive Darkness fan, as I suspect many of you are, and if you've seen my video where I demonstrated gameplay with Siegfried, showing Massive Darkness, the advantages of a red die over a yellow die having bigger and cooler effects that you can pull off, and the green die as opposed to the blue die being the better defensive dice. Now, the differences between the different faces. You have blank faces on both dice, which means that die didn't actually take into effect in that challenge. For the yellow dice, you have a single sword on a few of its facings, and then you have 2 swords and an explosion, which is called a BAM. That means a special effect that has been triggered based on that die. It's kind of a little bit like a critical hit, except you have a 1 in 6 chance on every yellow die of getting one of these. The red dice have a blank face, a single sword, that's a single success, also a 2 sword and a BAM result, has a couple of those, and the happy one, as you get more powerful, 3 swords and a gem. The gems are what activate the most powerful special abilities and are usually advanced, usually used with the more powerful gear that you have or unlocked skills that you have as you go up levels. So resolution involves looking at your gear. If you're on attack, it's looking at the weapons that are being employed and taking the dice that are associated with that weapon. If it is an attack coming in, you look at your defensive dice and you take the dice associated with your armor and any other gear that might apply. Then you roll the results and you instantly compare the numbers. If you have skills from that particular attempt that are triggered with BAMs, then you can pay for those abilities using the BAMs that you have rolled. Same thing with gems. Also, your enemies do the same thing. If they have abilities that are pertinent based on that attack or that defense, those can also be employed based on the dice that are rolled. So, it's an elegant system that handles everything at once that would otherwise be a series of complex structures. It also means that everything is very randomized. In Dungeons & Dragons, if your character has the ability to throw a fireball, you say, I'm going to throw a fireball. If you're playing a battle wizard in Massive Darkness and then you've unlocked the ability for a fireball, you need to roll 2 BAMs in order to activate that ability, which dishes out an extra 3 swords worth of damage. A pretty telling blow. Fireballs are not something to play around with. However, you need to get those 2 BAMs on an attack. So, if you have, say, a character like Elias, who in Shadow Mode, I believe, automatically starts out with a BAM, for every attack that he makes, he's halfway there. He just needs the dice to cooperate a little bit, and those fireballs can come pouring. Also, there are other means for getting them using gear, rings that you find, things of that nature. So, as you're accumulating all of this gear and you're unlocking skills by defeating monsters, when you defeat monsters, you get experience. You can use the experience at the end of every turn to buy skills that you can afford based off of your character sheet. And those are immediately usable by your character as you go. Contrast that to Dungeons & Dragons, where at the end of a session you are rewarded experience. If your experience has reached a plateau to go to another level, depending on the game, you can instantly unlock those, and the next time you play, you start out at the higher level, or possibly need training depending on how the game works. I've used both, and either one works fine depending on how detailed you want your world to be, how much you want to simulate a reality in your fantasy world. I personally kind of split. In a longer term campaign, I'm fine with training. That can be an interesting side venture, finding a reliable trainer. But otherwise, I don't like to punish my players just because they're in the middle of a dungeon. When they go, ding, I'm ready for a level. So, the combat is going to be different for both, but they both achieve a similar effect. As you get more powerful, your skills and abilities and gear unlocks more things that make you potent and dangerous, so that you can go against more and more powerful creatures. In Dungeons & Dragons, you unlock new skills, spells, abilities that make you more dangerous, so that you can go after more powerful monsters and survive greater threats and challenges. So, in a way, both of these have elements that are already balanced into that aspect of the game, and quite honestly, in almost any game that you play, combat is going to be the thing that is going to be the most heavily outlined, because ultimately it's the most complex concept that we have. Trying to survive against somebody who wants to kill you, or taking down a threat that needs to be put down for whatever reason. This is one of the core concepts of a role-playing game or many board games. So, it only stands to reason that both of them have developed their games around the combat systems. So, we have now gone over what basically separates them and how their mechanics work. So for this, our inaugural session of Dungeons & Darkness, we've discussed what separates the two game systems, how they work differently, and breaking down what exactly is going to be our challenge going forward. It's basically going to be taking all of those extra spaces and giving you a reason to care about them in Massive Darkness. Because what those extra spaces do in some cases, okay, Massive Darkness is never going to be about the bonds and the flaws and all that other stuff. That's all part of something that characters and players have had vested interest in differing amounts throughout the history of role-playing games. Some people like richly detailed backgrounds and reasons for your characters to do things. Some people just want a playing piece that they can smash the monsters with. So if you want your player to make backgrounds about your character, say you want an explanation for why Bjorn is there and ready to fight the monsters basically in just his underwear, because you can get unarmored defense that you can take off your armor and still be very well defended. Well, some people want to have that explanation and that backstory. As a storyteller, game master, dungeon master, it can be useful to kind of expand and give players reasons to do things outside of just, I want to be more powerful, I want to kill monsters. Contrast that to Massive Darkness, that element isn't in there. And honestly, we don't need to have mechanics for that. You can, as a dungeon master, game master, what have you, you can try as an experiment to unlock role-playing, explain what your character is doing there. Explain that Bjorn is a prince of the barbarian peoples who comes from his frozen tribes in the north because he heard tales that massive monsters and rich treasures await. So that's why he's there. He wants to test his skill against all the monsters and come away with great loot that he can bring back to his peoples. That's an actual C League further along in the development than a board game usually cares about. So that's something that's not mechanical, but starts to bring your board game into a more role-play aspect. Beyond that, it's all the other mechanics that we do not have that we will start looking into developing next time, starting with skills and non-combat challenges. So I hope this whets your appetite and that you stay tuned to this series. Dungeon Labs will be continuing on through Dungeons and Darkness, but also ultimately with other games as they come out. But we're going to, by the time we're done, have Dungeons and Darkness where a person can come in, play the game, and actually be playing a role-playing game over the elements of Massive Darkness. So that those of you who perhaps also enjoy role-playing games and have picked up Massive Darkness can use this to entertain your friends and kind of draw them into learning different elements about role-playing games if you so choose, such as the experience that I am in now. So, thank you for joining me here, and if you did enjoy this, please like, subscribe, hit the little bell so you're notified when I do more videos for this, and for other videos in the lair of OmnusI. This is going to be a continuing effort, an evolution of sorts, where we tackle bits and pieces of the mechanics. And starting with the next session, every time that we do another one of these Dungeons & Darkness settings, we're going to adapt one creature, element, something in Massive Darkness to Dungeons & Dragons, and take a creature or design element from Dungeons & Dragons and give you something that you can use in Massive Darkness. We won't have, the slick cards and everything like that. There are going to be some deviations if you use this content. Quite honestly, the card-based system is nice for a board game, but if you're going to be adding more and more things, we'll eventually want tables and something that you can roll on to decide what your players are going to find. But these little sacrifices are relatively minute in order to give your players the richest palette for all of the different bobs and bits and other things that you might be able to bring into the game from other game elements from that you may already have or are relatively accessible. So, thank you for joining me, and next time I will see you in the Dungeons and the Darkness.